So, picking up with the Egyptian campaign and Napoleon's use of propaganda, um, it was more than just simply Napoleon had claimed ultimate victory, and that led to his campaign as being seen as victorious by the people of France. There was also the fact that some notable achievements had been made. Napoleon didn't just bring soldiers with him on the Egyptian campaign, he also brought scientists and scholars and what today we would probably call anthropologists. Because they were going to one of the most mysterious locations in the world, at least to Europeans, that of Egypt. And so there was along with the campaign of Egypt, there were also these scientists and scholars studying the history of Egypt, which no one really knew anything about, because what the Egyptians had recorded in terms of anything written was the hieroglyphs. And the code, if you will, of the hieroglyphs had never been broken. So no one really knew even what little was written about the history of Egypt, what it said. So these French scientists and scholars had formed the so-called Egyptian Institute. And they saw the construction of laboratories, libraries, and even brought a printing press to Egypt. Probably the most noteworthy and greatest discovery made by these French people was the discovery of the so-called Rosetta Stone, which cracked the Egyptian hieroglyphic code. It was the code breaker, and it basically, therefore, gave birth to the study of Egypt known as Egyptology. And it created such a fervor in Europe of wanting to learn about this mysterious land, wanting to know everything about it. Egyptian fashion and culture became very popular within the wealthy and nobles and the monarchs of Europe. Ultimately, that Rosetta Stone would wind up in the hands of the British, for which it's still in, I believe, the British National Museum. But so there were some positives to it, and so we said that was sort of the third reason for Napoleon's rise to power. The fourth is that coming back from Egypt, he is now a national hero, and again he becomes one of these members of the last sort of ruling class of the revolution before he just takes complete power, and that was known as the consulate, which replaced the directory in 1799. But more or less, Napoleon, who was first consul, it has dictatorial powers at this point to secure his basically his power in Paris. He begins one more campaign into Italy, where the Austrians are ready to engage him to take back these territories. And in June of 1800, he meets them on the battlefield at the so-called Battle of Marengo, in which he doesn't just defeat the Austrians, he decisively defeats the Austrians. And when I say decisively defeats, what I mean is he doesn't just beat them on the battlefield, but he forces them into a political defeat. In other words, a treaty, a peace that will be in favor of Napoleon and will be very detrimental to whatever enemy it is, in this case, Austria. And per basically the treaty here, Austria has no claims on any parts of Italy. Thereafter, that is now French territory. And once again, he's really only faced with the British, who still will not relent in giving up this war against him. But even the British, by the year 1802, by the so-called Treaty of Amiens, Amiens, agrees to end hostilities with the French. And so by 1802, you see, for the first time in decades, a year of peace in Europe. It won't last very long. Now I want to look at Napoleon's domestic achievements and what he then brings to the conquered lands, what we'll talk about in the next video. So what was Napoleon's domestic achievements? Well, one, he centralized the government. He instituted reforms in areas such as banking and education, which was very important to him. He supported and patronized the science and the arts. And again, he improved relations between his regime and the Catholic Church and the Pope, which had been basically greatly suffered during the Revolution, which was highly deist or atheistic in nature. But perhaps the most significant and longest lasting achievement of Napoleon was the so-called Code Napoleon, or Napoleonic Code, which was this streamlined French legal system that took about some 300 local legal codes that ran throughout France and codified them into a single code of laws for the entire country, which was a major deal. In the Napoleonic Code, it preserved, 1, equality of all citizens before the law. 2, and this was major for the countries that he came to control, the absolute abolition of serfdom and feudalism. So Napoleon was responsible for ending feudalism in Europe, everywhere that he conquered, except for Russia, because he never conquered Russia, and it continued there. 3, religious tolerance. And 4, the protection of property rights. Napoleon created a strong centralized government with a strong bureaucracy, remember, based off of a meritocracy, in which capable officials landed in top positions instead of people based on their name or title or so on. So both civil and military offices worked on this system of a meritocracy. On the other hand, while freedoms were granted, free speech and insults to the government were not allowed. Of the sort of themes of the revolution, the one that Napoleon believed in the least, I suppose, was that of liberty, and certainly as it applied to individuals. Napoleon, remember, through propaganda, he controlled the media. He only wanted the French to know what he wanted them to know. And in fact, during his reign, he shut down 60 of France's 73 newspapers, the rest of which he largely ran himself. So propaganda and control of media was an important part of Napoleon's success as a ruler. So that question that we had looked at previously, which aspects of the French Revolution did Napoleon preserve and which did he destroy? Well, you can see many of the ideas in the Napoleonic Code are preserving the ideas of the revolution, particularly in creating the meritocracy, in ending feudalism, and in giving sort of equality to citizens before the law. But it wasn't a full meritocracy, because what Napoleon came to do in the end, as he came to control more and more territories, was he called in his brothers and sisters to help him rule these territories. And that's not a meritocracy, when you bring in your family members instead of people who certainly would have been much more capable of doing so. So, in the end, his grand empire was composed of sort of 3 major parts. And if you look on page 484, you'll see a very good map which shows this. Those in the darkest green are the parts of the French Empire. That is Napoleon's New France. And those that are in sort of the light green are those that he has conquered but has allowed to keep certain amounts of autonomy. But they're dependent on Napoleon now. But he puts in many of these places his relatives in control of certain of these new lands. He puts his brothers and sisters on the throne in Spain, which leads to a major revolution, a revolt we'll talk about later, of the new Netherlands, the Kingdom of Italy, the Swiss Republic, and this new area known as the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Also, he will do away with the Holy Roman Empire under his rule and create the so-called Confederation of the Rhine, which again was largely ruled by himself or relatives. Again, this is certainly not, you can't say this is the end of French aristocracy, because in effect what Napoleon has created is a new aristocracy. These people were given the titles of kings, princes, princesses, dukes, and duchesses. In other words, he created a different aristocracy, but nevertheless he created a new French aristocracy. Something that's somewhat overlooked sometimes about Napoleon's rule. While his military maintained a very strict meritocracy code, those that came to rule certain areas, even some of his marshals, his top generals, closest generals, that came to rule some of these areas, basically became part of a new aristocracy. And so, as we'll see, the expansion of his empire means ever increasing difficulty in having people he can trust control those areas. And while he can trust his relatives, are they always the best person for the job? No. And that leads to some difficulties. By 1803, the British had once again declared war on France. And so peace was over. And so the period of 1803 until 1815 is known as the Napoleonic Wars. And that map on page 484 that's largely what you're looking at. So in the next video, we'll look at I want to look at the sort of military matters as it relates to Napoleon, what he did in terms of innovation for the army, and basically explain then how it was so successful against so many different armies in Europe. And then in the last videos, we'll look at the wars themselves, the Napoleonic Wars, which lasted from 1803 until 1815. And lastly, we'll look at the downfall of Napoleon, what events led to that between the years 1812 and 1815, and what that meant for the map of Europe and the future of Europe.